He stood in the doorway and did not move. He had come down for water. That was the whole of it. A simple, ordinary reason that had nothing to do with anything. The estate was quiet. The gala was behind them. He had been sitting in his study for 2 hours, staring at a wall, and he had come downstairs for water. That was what he told himself. The kitchen light was on. He heard their voices before he reached the door. Low, unhurried, the specific quality of two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to speak inside them. He slowed. He did not examine why he slowed. He stopped just outside the doorway, where the corridor's darkness met the kitchen's warmth, and he looked through the gap between the door and its frame. She was sitting at the table. Plain clothes, natural hair in a low bun, the gala version of her dismantled, the everyday version restored. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the table in front of her with the expression he had come to recognize over 8 weeks as her processing face, the face she wore when something was too large and complicated for the room around her. Kwok sat across from her. He was speaking quietly. Sujin could not hear every word, just the shape of them, the measured, unhurried rhythm of a man saying something true without dressing it up. Then Kwok reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Sujin went completely still, not the controlled stillness of a man in command of himself, the other kind, the kind that happened before the command arrived, the involuntary freeze of a body that has registered something before the mind has decided what to do about it. He looked at Kwok's hand over Sujin's hand on the kitchen table. He looked at the warmth of the kitchen light falling across both of them. He looked at Kwok's face, open, honest, the face of a man saying goodbye to something he had never been given the right to hold, and at Sujin's face, which was doing something quiet and grateful and real. He had seen Kwok's face do many things in 4 years. He had never seen it do that. Something cold and sourceless moved through him, starting somewhere behind his sternum and spreading outward with no name and no justification and no interest in either. He pressed his back against the corridor wall. He was outside the kitchen light now, in the shadow where the corridor was dark and the warmth did not reach. Through the doorway, he watched Kwok stand, pick up his cup, walk toward the kitchen door. Sujin stepped back further into the shadow. 1 step, then 2, until the darkness of the corridor was complete around him and the kitchen doorway was just a rectangle of warm light at the end of it. Kwok walked through it and turned away down the corridor toward his own quarters without looking back. He did not see Sujin standing in the dark. Nobody saw. That was the thing Sejun would carry into the rest of that night and the morning after it and every moment of what came next. Not what he had seen, not the hand, not the warmth, not Kwok's face doing the thing it had never done before. What he would carry was the fact that he had stepped back into the shadow, that he had chosen the dark over the doorway, that nobody knew he had been there. Nobody knew what it cost him. Welcome back to Afro-Ka Mafia Stories. Before we go any further, if you are new here, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because this story is not gentle and it is not short, and you cannot afford to miss a single part of it. And if you have been here since part 1, drop a black in the comments right now so I know my people are here. Let's go. 14 hours earlier, the garden was dark, and the gala was still humming faintly through the estate lulls, and Zuri was standing very still in the lavender dress, with an ivory envelope on the wall beside her, and the weight of 8 weeks collapsing quietly around her feet. She did not touch the envelope. She walked back to the staff entrance with her hands steady and her face arranged and the specific, determined composure of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury and she has never been able to afford it. She went to her staff quarters. She sat on the narrow bed. She was still in the lavender dress, the dress he had chosen, the dress he had sent with no note because a note would have been the truth, and she did not have the energy to take it off. And she did not have the energy to think about why that mattered, and she did not have the energy for any of the 17 things her mind was trying to process simultaneously. She lay back on the narrow bed with her eyes open and stared at the ceiling. I am the person who placed your name on the Quan Estate's hiring list 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks. Every morning, every corridor, every cup of tea in the kitchen, and every errand and every evening that had started to feel like something real was building inside it, all of it had been a door someone else opened, a room someone else put her in, a life she thought she was choosing that had been chosen for her by a woman standing in a garden shadow with an ivory envelope and 3 days and a threat so clean it did not even need to raise its voice. She thought about the silk head wrap. She thought about don't. She thought about a white box with no note. She thought about standing in the corridor in lavender while he said, "You don't belong in this room," in the voice of a man saying the opposite of what he meant. And now the envelope, and Park Soon-ja, and 3 days. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Se-jun did not sleep either. He sat in his study until 2 in the morning with nothing open on his desk and nothing in his hands, and the specific, exhausted alertness of a man whose mind would not stop running a calculation he had not asked it to run. At 2:15, he went to the window. The east garden was dark. The estate grounds were quiet. The ivory envelope was still on the wall where the woman had left it, a small, pale shape in the moonlight, sitting there with the patience of something that knew it would be found. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put on his shoes. The garden was cold at that hour. The gala warmth was entirely gone. The estate had exhaled and settled back into its true temperature, which was always, underneath the events and the lighting and the performance of hospitality, considerably colder than it appeared. He crossed the garden to the wall. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. He read it standing in the dark, with the moonlight barely enough to make out the words, and read it again to make sure he had understood correctly. And then he stood very still for a moment with the open envelope in his hand and the cold garden around him and the estate rising behind him full of sleeping staff and one woman on a narrow bed who was not sleeping either. The vault. A document. 3 days. And underneath the access details and the instructions, the threat, worded carefully, almost politely, the specific politeness of someone who has thought through every version of how this goes and has made their peace with all of them. Kwon Se-jun has never had a reason to doubt what happened inside his own walls. Give him one. He folded the envelope. He put it in his pocket. He stood in the garden for another moment, looking up at the estate, at the dark windows, the controlled surfaces, the building that reflected him so precisely it was almost a mirror, and felt something he had not felt in 3 years of running this operation. He felt like something had gotten inside. Not the envelope, not Park Soon-ja. He did not have her name yet, but he had the shape of her, the method of her, and that was enough to begin. Not even the threat. Her. Something about her had gotten inside this estate, inside his corridors and his kitchen and his sitting room and his window-watching evenings, and he had let it happen and called it logistics and called it surveillance and called it everything except what it actually was. And now she was on a narrow bed in the staff quarters in a dress he had sent her, and someone had used that, used the specific, unnamed, carefully unexamined thing between them as the mechanism of a plan. He turned and walked back inside. He went to her door. He knocked. She opened it still in the lavender dress. He looked at her, at the dress, at the specific exhaustion in her face that she was holding very carefully behind her composure, at the fact that she had not slept and had not changed and had been lying on that narrow bed in his color for however many hours had passed since the garden. He held up the envelope. Her face did not change. She had been waiting for this. He could tell by the way her expression settled rather than shifted, the way a person looks when the thing they had been bracing for finally arrived. "Explain," he said. One word, quiet, the most dangerous version of his voice, not loud, not cold, just stripped of everything except the request itself. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let him in. She told him everything. Not because she had decided to, not because she had spent the sleepless hours on that narrow bed constructing the right version of events to present to him in the right order with the right framing. She told him everything because he was standing in her staff quarters at 2 in the morning, holding the envelope and looking at her with the specific, stripped-back expression of a man who had already decided he was going to hear the truth and was simply waiting for her to begin. So, she began. The woman in the garden. The hiring list. 8 weeks ago. Before she arrived, before the reference letter, before the Thursday morning at the gate with one bag and the specific exhaustion of a woman who had stopped expecting good things. Someone had already decided she would be here. Someone had looked at her life, at the gaps in it, the needs in it, the specific vulnerability of a woman who required work and had no one to protect her, and had seen a door. She told him about the threat, the document in the vault, the 3 days, the specific, polite brutality of give him one reason to doubt what happened inside his own walls, delivered in a garden at night by a woman who had never once raised her voice. She told him all of it standing in the middle of her staff quarters in the lavender dress with her hands at her sides and her eyes on his face and nothing held back. Not because she was brave, because she was tired. Because the weight of the envelope had been building since the garden, and she had been carrying it alone in the dark for hours, and she did not have anything left to spend on performance. He listened. He stood near the door with the envelope in his hand, and he listened to every word without interrupting, without moving, without letting his face do anything she could read clearly. Just listening. With the complete, consuming attention of a man who was taking something seriously because it deserved to be taken seriously, even though the cost of taking it seriously was considerable. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He looked at the envelope, then at her. "You were in my home for 8 weeks," he said, "and someone put you here." "Yes." "Before you arrived, before the reference letter, before any of it." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Something was working in his expression. She could see it the way she had always been able to see it, in the place just behind the controlled surface where the things he did not say lived. "And you didn't tell me?" he said. "I found out last night," she said, "in the garden, in your dress." She paused. The pause had weight in it. "After the gala, after everything, I found out last night." He looked at the dress. She watched him look at it, the deep architectural lavender, his choice, his color, the thing he had sent with no note because naming it felt too dangerous, and she watched something move through his face that he did not entirely manage to contain. Something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and lived in the specific territory between them where powerful men went when they had made themselves vulnerable and found out it had cost them. "And if she hadn't threatened you," he said quietly, "what would you have done?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. She held his gaze. "I would have told you," she said. "You don't know that." "I know that," she said, steadily, without argument, the way she said everything, directly, at the full cost of the directness. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the envelope in his pocket. "Stay in the estate," he said. He walked out. The door closed. She stood in the middle of the room in the lavender dress and breathed. Not relief. She was nowhere near relief. Something more complicated than that. The specific, suspended feeling of a person who has told the truth and now has to wait to find out what the truth costs. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She looked at the white box on the desk, the box the dress had come in, still sitting there with the silk ribbon draped across it. No note. She had understood then what the absence of a note meant. She understood it more completely now. She put her face in her hands. Not crying, just, finally, briefly, in the privacy of a room with a closed door, allowing herself to be exactly as tired as she was. Kwok had been awake since 5. This was not unusual. He kept early hours by habit and by temperament, the specific discipline of a man who understood that the first hour of the morning was when most things that mattered got decided before the day had fully assembled itself. He reviewed the security feeds with his coffee the way other people read the news, methodically, without hurry. He was on the 3rd feed when he saw her, a woman entering the East Garden from the outer perimeter at 23 minutes past 11 the previous evening, Korean, 50s, elegantly dressed in a long, dark coat, moving with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who had assessed the estate's external security and found it manageable. She stood in the garden shadow for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then she walked away. Kwok set his coffee down. He ran the timestamp back, watched it again. Then he pulled up the guest registry for the gala. Every name, every vehicle, every arrival and departure time. He went through it with a patience that had made him exceptional at this work for 11 years. Cross-referencing, eliminating, narrowing. She was not on the list. He ran her face through the syndicate's intelligence registry, then through the broader network databases that the Quan operation maintained through 3 layers of proxy access. He was thorough, and he was not in a hurry, and he had learned long ago that the most important information was almost always the information that should not have been there. The name came back in 40 minutes. Park Soon-ja. He read the file slowly, all of it. The Incheon faction's 18 months of quiet, hostile positioning, the method, never force, always people, find the vulnerability, place the right person, wait for the damage to propagate through the target's own walls. He read the section on current operations. He put the file down. He sat very still for a moment in his chair with the morning light coming through the window and the coffee going cold beside him, and the specific, careful stillness of a man who has just understood several things simultaneously and is deciding what to do with all of them at once. He picked up the file. He went to find Sejun. The study door was closed but not locked. Kwok had standing permission to enter without knocking in the mornings, an arrangement that had existed for 4 years and had never needed to be revisited. He opened the door. Sejun was at his desk. He was dressed. Dark shirt, dark trousers, the composed surface fully assembled despite the hour and whatever the night had cost him. The desk in front of him was empty. He was not working. He was sitting in the specific, controlled stillness of a man who had been waiting for something to arrive that would tell him what to do next. Kwok put the file on the desk. He did not explain it. He did not introduce it. He simply placed it in front of his employer and stepped back and waited. Sejun opened it. He read it. Kwok watched his face, the thing he had done for 4 years, reading this man's contained expressions the way a navigator reads weather. The file moved through Sejun's face in small, precise increments. Recognition, recalibration, the specific shift of a person who has just had the shape of a situation change. Park Soon-ja, Sejun said. It was not a question. It was a man placing a name on a thing that had not had one until this moment.
Incheon faction, Kwok said. 18 months of positioning. This is how she works. She does not come at an operation directly. She finds a human entry point and plants it and waits. She used the Maid, Sejun said. His voice was even, controlled. Kwok heard what was underneath the control because he had been listening underneath this man's control for 4 years. As a key, Kwok said carefully, for the vault document. A pause. Sejun looked at the file. Then he looked at the wall above it with the expression of a man doing a calculation in real time. The document she wanted, he said slowly. I moved it 3 months ago, when we first detected unusual traffic patterns around the lower-level access corridor. Kwok looked at him. The silence that followed had a very specific quality, the quality of 2 men simultaneously arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. Then Zuri was sent in for nothing, Kwok said. For nothing, Sejun confirmed. He closed the file. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the desk with the specific, decisive energy of a man who has just identified a problem and already knows how he is going to solve it. I need 3 calls, he said. Give me the room. Kwok nodded. He picked up his coffee cup from the corner of the desk where he had set it. He walked to the door. Junho. He stopped, turned. Sejun was looking at the closed file on his desk. Not at Kwok, at the file. She had no one, he said. His voice was very quiet. When she came here. She had no one. Park Soon-ja knew that. Kwok said nothing. He waited. That was the vulnerability, Sejun said, that she had no one. It was not said as an observation. It was said as something else, something that did not have a clean professional category and that Sejun was not going to look at directly, but was saying out loud anyway because the room was empty except for the one person he trusted enough for the room to be empty. Yes, Kwok said simply. He left. Sejun went back to her quarters an hour later. He knocked. She opened the door. She had changed out of the lavender dress, plain black clothes again, hair pulled back, the invisible armor of a woman who had decided to be staff again, because staff was the only category available to her in this house, and she needed something to stand inside of. He looked at her. Then he said it directly, the way she always said things, without preparation, without softening, because she had taught him by example that directness was its own form of respect. "The document Park Soon-ja sent you for," he said, "it was never in the vault." She went very still. "I moved it 3 months ago, before you arrived, before any of this. She sent you in for something that was already gone." She looked at him. He watched it move through her face, the full shape of it arriving in stages. The mission that had threatened her and positioned her and turned 8 weeks of her life into a mechanism. The threat that had been held over her head in a garden at night. The 3 days. All of it. For a document that had not been there. "She threatened me," Zuri said. Her voice was very quiet. "She said she would tell you I was planted, that you—" "I know what she said," he said. "And?" He looked at her steadily. "And I already know, and I'm telling you anyway." The silence between them shifted. Not gone, but different. The silence of 2 people who have just moved without announcing it, from opposite sides of something to the same side.
"She looked at my life," Zuri said. The quietness of her voice had changed quality. It was no longer the quietness of composure. It was the quietness of something heated to a very precise and dangerous temperature. "She looked at everything I had and everything I didn't have, and she saw a door." He said nothing. "She used me," Zuri said. "Like I was a key, like I was a thing." "Yes," he said. "And the whole time—" She stopped, looked at the wall, then back at him. "The whole time I was here, everything that happened, she was watching all of it and calculating all of it, and none of it was—" She stopped again. The unfinished sentence sat in the room between them. Both of them knew what the end of it was. Neither of them said it. "I'm going to handle Park Soon-ja," he said. "You don't need to do anything. You don't need to touch the envelope. You don't need to go near the vault. It's already done." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means it's already done," he said. He left her doorway for the second time that morning. This time, when he walked away down the corridor, his pace was different. Not the retreat of a man putting distance between himself and something he could not manage. The deliberate stride of a man who has identified a target and is moving toward it. She stood in her doorway and watched him go. Something in her chest did something she did not entirely have instructions for. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She looked at the white box on the desk. She thought about a woman who had looked at her life and seen a door, and a man who had just told her, without softening it, without making it into something it was not, that the door led nowhere, that she had been used for nothing, that the threat was empty, and then walked away to deal with it, as if that was simply what you did, as if she was simply worth dealing with it for. She sat with that for a long time. Kwok brought her the file himself. He did not have to. It was not his responsibility, and it was not his instruction, and there was no professional reason for him to walk to the estate kitchen at mid-morning and place a document in front of a woman who was sitting alone at a table that had become, over 8 weeks, the quietest and most honest corner of a house full of controlled surfaces. He did it because he was Kwok Jun-ho, and that was the kind of man he was. She looked up when he came in. He set the file on the table in front of her without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "Park Soon-ja," he said simply. "Everything we have on her." He sat down across from her. Not to watch her read it, just to be there while she did. The way he had always been. Present, unhurried, asking nothing. She opened the file. She read slowly, the way she did everything, with complete attention, missing nothing, paying the full cost of understanding. The Incheon faction. 18 months. The method that never changed because it never needed to. Find the human vulnerability. Plant the right person. Wait. She read the section that described the specific calculation Park Soon-ja had made about the Kwon estate, the analysis of its security, the identification of its gaps, the line that described the chosen entry point. Female. African. Young. Financially vulnerable. No local connections, no syndicate affiliation, high employability, low suspicion profile. She read it twice. She closed the file. The kitchen was very quiet around her. Outside the window, the soul morning was doing what soul mornings did, continuing, indifferent, full of light and movement and the complete absence of any awareness of what was happening inside this particular building on this particular day. She looked at my life, Zuri said. Her voice was very quiet. Not broken, not performing steadiness, just quiet, in the way that things were quiet when they had been heated past a certain point and come out the other side of it into something harder and more permanent than anger. And she saw a door. Kwok said nothing. He stayed. She read everything I didn't have, Zuri continued. Everything I needed. Everything that made me manageable. She paused. And she decided I was useful. She looked at the closed file on the table. Not a person, she said. A key. The word sat in the room. Kwok let it sit. He understood that there were moments when the most useful thing a person could offer was the willingness to stay inside a difficult silence without trying to fix it. After a moment, Zuri looked up at him. You found her, she said. This morning, he said. Security feed from last night. It took 40 minutes to get the name. She looked at him, the specific look she had given him across this table many times over 8 weeks, the one that saw him clearly and did not look away from what it found. Thank you, she said. Not for the file, not for the 40 minutes or the database searches or the professional efficiency of a man who was very good at his work. For all of it. For the errand cover in the first week, for the name learned on day 3 and placed somewhere he would not lose it, for the tea and the kitchen and the uncomplicated decency of being treated like a person in a house that had not been built to notice her. For all of it, without saying all of it. He nodded once. He picked up his cup. He looked at the table for a moment, their table, their corner, the kitchen that had been the warmest room in a cold house, with the expression of a man taking a quiet inventory of something he is about to leave behind. Then he looked at her.
He's going to handle it, he said. Park Soonja. He's already started. A pause. He doesn't do things loudly, but he does them completely. She looked at him. I know, she said. I know you know, Kwok said. He said it simply, not with bitterness, not with the specific weight of a man communicating his awareness of something painful, just simply, the way he said everything, like a man who had made his peace with the truth of a situation and was no longer spending energy fighting the shape of it. He stood up. Junho, she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the table. She did not have the words for what she wanted to say, or perhaps she had too many of them, all of them insufficient, all of them arriving at the same inadequate destination. He looked back at her with the warm, open eyes that had been the first genuinely kind thing she encountered in this estate, and she thought about 8 weeks and tea and covered errands and a man who asked, "Are you all right?" and meant it. "I'm sorry," she said finally. She stopped. He shook his head, gently, the specific gesture of a man declining something that does not need to be offered. Don't, he said, and something about that word, the same quiet register, a completely different man, made something move through her chest that she absorbed without letting it reach her face. He walked to the kitchen doorway. He paused there with his back to her and his cup in his hand, and the corridor stretching ahead of him toward whatever the rest of the day required. You hum when you work, he said quietly, to the doorway, to the corridor, to no one in particular. I always liked that. He walked away. The kitchen settled into its silence. Zuri sat at the table alone and looked at her hands and breathed and told herself she was fine and almost believed it. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that the corridor had not been empty. He had come down the corridor from the study with the specific, purposeful energy of a man in the middle of something that required his complete attention. He had heard voices. He had slowed. He had stopped just outside the kitchen doorway where the corridor's darkness met the kitchen's warm light and looked through the gap between the door and its frame and seen them at the table, Kwok and Zuri, the file between them, her face doing the thing it did when something was too large and complicated for the room around her. He had stood there and watched Kwok stay. He had watched her say thank you in the way she said it, without specifying, without listing, the specific economy of a woman who trusted the other person to understand the full weight of what she was carrying under 2 words. He had watched Kwok's face receive it, and then Kwok had stood and walked to the doorway and paused there with his back to the room and said, quietly to the corridor, to no one, "You hum when you work. I always liked that." Sejin stood in the shadow of the corridor and felt something move through him that had no clean name and no justifiable basis and no interest in either of those facts. It moved through him the way the thing in the kitchen moved through him the night before, the warmth and the hand and the open face, except this time it was worse, because this time it was a goodbye, and he could hear it, and he could not look away from it, and he could not do anything except stand in the dark and carry it alone. Kwok walked out of the kitchen and turned away down the corridor without looking back. He did not see Sejin. Sejin pressed himself back against the wall, 1 step into the shadow, then 2, until the darkness was complete around him, and the kitchen doorway was just a rectangle of warm light at the end of it, with Zuri sitting inside it alone at the table looking at her hands. He stayed there for 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the study without the file he had come for. He did not need it anymore. He sat at his desk and looked at the wall and felt the full, unmanageable weight of being a man who had spent 6 weeks watching from windows and standing in doorways and choosing the shadow every single time, and understanding, with the specific, exhausted clarity of 2 in the morning and a garden envelope and a corridor goodbye, that the shadow was a choice. That it had always been a choice, that he had been making it so long he had started to believe it was simply where he lived. He picked up his phone. He made the 3rd call. By evening, Park Soon-ja's northern networks were gone. Not loudly, not with announcement or confrontation or any of the visible machinery of syndicate warfare, simply gone. The access points closed, the connections severed, the 18 months of careful, patient positioning dismantled in 8 hours by a man who understood that the most effective action was always the action that looked like nothing from the outside. Sejin did not tell Zuri this directly. He came to the kitchen that evening. All 3 of them ended up there, the way they had ended up there before, the kitchen pulling them in the way warm rooms pulled people in cold houses. And he said it to the room, to Kwok, to the table, to the general atmosphere of the kitchen at evening, with something on the stove and the overhead light doing what it always did, which was make everything look more survivable than it had seemed in the dark. "It's done," he said. "Park Soon-ja won't be moving against this estate again." Kwok nodded. Zuri looked at him. He did not say, "I did this for you." He did not say anything else. He just looked back at her across the kitchen with the face of a man who had done the only available thing and was not going to dress it up as more than that. She held his gaze. Something passed between them in the kitchen light, unspoken, unresolved but present, real, the specific reality of 2 people who had been circling something for 6 weeks and had just, without announcement, stopped circling and stood still. Kwok quietly pushed back his chair. "I'll check the morning feed," he said. He picked up his jacket. He walked out of the kitchen without looking at either of them. The corridor took him, and the sound of his footsteps faded, and the kitchen was quiet. Later, much later, when the estate had fully settled and the staff quarters corridor was dark and the only light still on was the one in her room, he came to her door. He knocked. She opened it. He was in a dark navy shirt, no jacket, no professional reason assembled in advance. He looked like a man who had made a decision and had not dressed it up in anything on the way here. Just himself, standing in her doorway in the staff quarters corridor at the end of the longest day either of them had had in a very long time. She looked at him. He looked at her.
For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the corridor held its silence around them the way it always had, that particular managed silence of a house with everything carefully controlled, except that it did not feel managed right now. It felt like the silence before something true. "I read those reports twice every morning," he said. His voice was quiet. Not the corridor voice, or the authority voice, or the controlled professional register she had spent 8 weeks learning to read underneath. Just his voice. The one that had said "don't" in a sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon, and had not been the same since. She was very still. "The schedule. The meals." He paused. "The dress." Another pause. Shorter, like he was moving through a list of things he had been refusing to look at directly and was looking at them now, one by one, in the specific order they had happened. None of it was logistics. She looked at him. She had always looked at him directly, from the first corridor, from the first time he had stopped walking because of a sound she had not known she was making. She looked at him now the same way, directly, at the full cost of the directness. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I just needed to say it." The corridor was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the estate, a clock marked the hour, small, distant, the sound of a house continuing its business regardless of what was happening in this particular doorway at this particular moment. The kitchen light was still on at the end of the hall. The white box with the silk ribbon was on the desk behind her. The lavender dress was inside it, folded carefully, the way she folded everything, with the precise attention of someone who had learned early that taking care of small things was the only reliable way to feel like you had any control at all. He did not cross the threshold. He stayed in the doorway, the same careful distance he had always kept, and this time the distance was not armor, and it was not cold, and it was not the professional performance of a man who had decided exactly how close he would allow himself to stand. It was just space. Her space. The space of a woman who had come to his estate with one bag and a reference letter, and the exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting good things, and who had spent 8 weeks being exactly herself inside his walls, without apology, and without performance, and without once asking him for anything he had not already decided to give. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The silk head wrap," he said quietly. "My mother wore it on Sunday mornings, when she thought nobody was watching." He paused. "You looked—" He stopped. Started again. "I couldn't move. That's why I said don't, not because of the wrap." His jaw was very tight. "Because of how you looked wearing it, like the house remembered something it had been trying to forget." The corridor held its breath. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had built an empire on the principle that nothing happened inside his walls without his knowledge and his consent. The man who had stood at windows and read reports twice and sent dresses with no notes and chosen the shadow every time, because the shadow was the only place that felt safe for someone who did not know how to want something he could not control. She stepped back from the door. Not away from him. Back, making room. The specific, deliberate, unhurried step back of a woman who had decided, not because she had been convinced, not because she had been overwhelmed, but because she had looked at the full truth of a situation and made her own choice inside it, that the doorway was not where this ended. He looked at the space she had made. Then he stepped inside. The door stayed open. The kitchen light was still on at the end of the hall. The clock continued its business. The estate held its nighttime silence around them, that particular managed silence that was not managed anymore, that had not been managed since a Tuesday afternoon in a sitting room when a door opened and something that had been cold for years found warmth it did not know how to name. Outside in the corridor, just past the edge of the doorway's light, standing in the shadow of the hallway with his jacket over his arm and his cup in his hand, and the specific, steady expression of a man who had always known and had made his peace with the knowing, Kwok Jun-ho stood for a moment. He had come back for his phone. He had left it on the kitchen table. He had walked back down the corridor and had seen the light under her door and had seen the shadow of 2 people in the doorway and had stopped. He looked at the open door. He looked at the warm light spilling from it into the corridor. He breathed. Then he turned around. He walked back down the corridor toward the kitchen, toward his phone, toward the morning feed he would check before anyone else was awake, toward the next day and the one after it, and all the days of doing his job with the quiet, loyal excellence that had always been the fullest expression of who he was. He did not look back. The corridor held his footsteps for a moment. Then it let them go. Now I need you to go to the comments right now and tell me, did Kwok Jun-ho deserve better? Because I think we all know the answer, and I think it is going to hurt every single one of you to say it. Drop a heart if this story got you. Share it with someone who needs a good story today. And subscribe, because the next story is already coming. And trust me, it is going to be mind-blowing in the best possible way.